The boardroom on the 43rd floor of the Caldwell Group Tower smelled the way old money always smells. Leather and recycled air and something faintly chemical, like the room itself had been preserved against change. Walter Drummond sat at the far end of the table and said nothing. He was the kind of man people noticed for the wrong reasons first. The gray blazer was slightly too wide at the shoulders, the kind you buy off the rack and never quite get altered. His watch was a Timex. His shoes were clean but worn at the heel. He had the look of someone's accountant, or perhaps a retired school principal from a mid-sized town in Ontario, the sort of man you seat near the back at a gala and forget by dessert. That was, of course, by design. Across the table, the Caldwell family arranged themselves like a portrait commissioned to convey authority. Stuart Caldwell sat in the center, 71 years old, silver-haired, the kind of man who had learned to make silence feel like a threat. To his left sat his daughter, Claudia Voss, who had her father's jaw and none of his patience. To his right sat Marcus Caldwell, the elder son, who had flown in from Vancouver and had not yet stopped checking his phone. There were lawyers, there were assistants, there was a woman with a tablet who had not introduced herself and appeared to have no intention of doing so. The deal on the table was worth $470 million. Walter Drummond had not asked for this meeting. He had been invited, which, in the language of people like Stuart Caldwell, meant something closer to summoned. "We appreciate you making the time," Stuart said. He did not sound particularly appreciative. Walter looked at him the way a man looks at weather, observing it, not worried by it. "Of course," he said. The offer, as Stuart Caldwell's lead counsel explained it over the next 20 minutes, was structured as an acquisition. Full purchase of Drummond Environmental Solutions, the consulting and remediation firm Walter had built over 23 years, from a single contract in northern Manitoba into a company with operations across 6 provinces and 2 territories. The Caldwell Group would absorb the firm entirely. The team could stay, the branding could stay for a period of transition. Walter's role, however, would change. "We'd bring you on as a senior advisor," Claudia said. She said it the way people say it when they mean something else. "Your expertise is valuable. We want to leverage that and the current management structure." Walter asked. "Would be integrated into our existing leadership team," Marcus said, not looking up from his phone. "Who would I report to?" The question landed in the room and sat there. Stuart Caldwell leaned forward slightly. "You'd report to our operations division. Claudia oversees that portfolio." Walter nodded slowly. He didn't say anything for a moment. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, Toronto stretched out in the flat gray light of a November afternoon, the lake a dark line at the edge of everything. "And the remediation contracts currently in progress in Saskatchewan and Nunavut?" Walter asked. "Would continue under our management," said the lawyer. "Those contracts," Walter said, "were awarded specifically because of our team's track record and my personal certification history with the Federal Environmental Authority. If the management structure changes, the contracts may need to be renegotiated." There was a brief silence that Claudia filled. "We have a legal team that can manage that transition." Walter looked at her for a moment. Then he looked down at the folder in front of him, which he had not opened since sitting down. "I'm sure you do," he said. Stuart Caldwell cleared his throat. It was, Walter knew, a man clearing space for dominance. "Walter, may I call you Walter? You may." "Walter, let's be direct. Your firm is good. It's a solid regional operation. But the market is consolidating. The federal contracts are getting more competitive. The big international firms are moving into this space. You can either scale with a partner who has the resources to compete at that level, or you can watch the window close." He paused. "We're offering you a very clean exit." "I'm not looking for an exit," Walter said. Marcus Caldwell finally put down his phone. He had his father's height and none of his restraint. "Come on. You're, what, 62? 63? 60, Walter said. "Right. So you've got a good run ahead of you. A few more years of building, maybe. But the capital to compete at the national level. You don't have it. We do. It's a practical question." Walter looked at Marcus Caldwell the way you look at someone who has said something that reveals more about themselves than they intended. He didn't respond directly. "Can I ask about the valuation basis?" Walter said. The lawyer slid a document across the table. "We used the standard EBITDA multiple for firms in your sector, adjusted for market risk and the regulatory uncertainty in." "You used 4 times EBITDA," Walter said without opening the document. That's correct. Our last completed audit put EBITDA at just over 19 million. Yes, 4 times 19 is 76 million, Walter said, not 470. Silence. The lawyer adjusted something on his tablet. The offer accounts for goodwill, brand value, the existing contract pipeline, and a premium for. I know what $470 million accounts for, Walter said. I'm asking why you offered that number for a firm you just described as a solid regional operation. It was Claudia who recovered first. She was better at this than her brother, Walter noted. She had the composure of someone who had been prepared for this question and didn't want anyone to know it. Because we believe in the growth potential, she said. We see what this company could be with the right resources behind it. With the right resources, Walter repeated. Meaning yours. Meaning ours. He nodded. Then he was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone thinking about what to say next, but the quiet of someone who had already decided and was simply letting the room settle before he said it. Can I tell you something about how this company was built? He said. No one said no. No one exactly said yes. I started this with a single contract to assess contamination at a decommissioned refinery site outside Thompson, Manitoba. I was 37. My daughter was 8. I was driving a 1998 Ranger that needed a new alternator, and I was doing the assessment work myself because I couldn't afford to hire anyone yet. He paused. The report I submitted on that site led to a remediation process that eventually cleaned up 14 hectares of soil that had been classified as a permanent loss. The family that had farmed the adjacent land for 3 generations sold it for residential development 6 years later. He said this without ceremony. He wasn't performing the story, he was just telling it. I built this firm on that kind of work. Every contract we've held because the people awarding those contracts trust the name on the door. They trust me. They trust my team. They trust that when we say a site is clean, it's clean. He looked at Stuart Caldwell. That trust isn't a brand asset you can transfer in an acquisition. It's not in that folder. Stuart Caldwell's expression did not change. He had heard many things in many boardrooms, and he had learned to hear them all with the same face. What are you saying, Walter? I'm saying I understand the offer, Walter said, and I appreciate that you've invested considerable time in structuring it. But I'm not going to accept it. Marcus made a sound. It wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite disbelief. It was somewhere between the two, which is the sound people make when they've assumed a conclusion and the world declines to cooperate. You're turning down $470 million, he said. I'm turning down this structure, Walter said. Yes. The structure, Claudia repeated. The structure in which I report to your operations division, the team I've built loses its autonomy, and my role becomes advisory in name while being ornamental in practice. He was still calm. He hadn't raised his voice once. I've spent 23 years making decisions that I was accountable for and being accountable for them. What you're offering me is the appearance of a role without the substance of one. I'm not interested in that. Stuart Caldwell leaned back. When he spoke, his voice had changed slightly, not softer exactly, but adjusted, like a thermostat dropping by 1 degree. You could stay on in a meaningful capacity, he said. I appreciate that, Walter said, but I think our definitions of meaningful are different. Your definitions, Marcus said, and there was something in his voice now that Walter recognized, the specific edge of someone who has decided to stop pretending to be polite. Your definitions, do you understand what this number means? Do you have any idea what 470 million can do, what you could do with that? I have some idea, Walter said. Then what exactly are you holding out for? This isn't ideology. This is money. Walter looked at Marcus Caldwell. He thought about the alternator in the 1998 Ranger. He thought about 14 hectares of soil. He thought about his daughter, who was now 31 and running the logistics division of the firm her father had built, and who had his same habit of going quiet before she said something that mattered. It's not ideology, Walter agreed. But it's not just money either. He picked up his folder, the one he had never opened. He stood. He was not a tall man, and standing didn't make him commanding exactly. But it changed the geometry of the room in a way that couldn't be argued with. I'll have my counsel follow up with yours about the details of the conversation. If there's a structure that makes sense for both sides, I'm open to hearing it. But this one doesn't. He looked at Stuart Caldwell, not at Marcus, Not at Claudia, but at the man who still, at 71, set the terms in that room. Thank you for the meeting. Stewart Caldwell held his gaze for a moment. Something moved across his face, not quite respect, but something adjacent to it, which was perhaps more rare. Walter Drummond picked up his coat from the back of his chair, the same gray blazer he'd worn in, and walked toward the elevator. The woman with the tablet watched him go. She had not said a word the entire meeting. What none of the Caldwells knew, because they had not thought to look beyond the EBITDA multiple and the contract pipeline, was the specific nature of what they had almost acquired. Drummond Environmental Solutions held something that did not appear on any balance sheet. 11 years earlier, Walter had quietly negotiated a partnership with 3 First Nations communities in northern Saskatchewan and 1 in Manitoba. Not a token consultation arrangement of the kind that looked good in annual reports, but a genuine co-management structure, developed over 18 months of conversation, in which those communities had a formal voice in how assessments were conducted and remediation plans were designed on their traditional territories. The arrangement was built on trust that had taken years to earn, and it had given Walter's firm first right of access for any environmental assessment work on over 40,000 square kilometers of land that was, as federal resource policy evolved, becoming enormously strategically valuable. This arrangement was not transferable. The communities had made that clear, not in legal language, but in the way that matters more than legal language, as a simple fact of how the relationship worked. If the firm changed hands without their consent, the arrangement ended, and they had not been consulted. Walter had known this when he walked into the boardroom. He had said nothing about it, not because he intended to deceive anyone, but because no one had asked him the right questions. The Caldwells had done extensive due diligence on the financials. They had reviewed the contract pipeline, the liability exposure, the regulatory standing. They had looked at the numbers. They had not thought to ask what the numbers rested on. 3 weeks after the meeting at the Caldwell Group Tower, Walter was having coffee at a Tim Hortons on Wellington Street in Ottawa, the one near the market, not the one near Parliament Hill, which always had a lineup of staffers who ordered complicated things and looked harried. He had a double-double and a plain bagel with cream cheese, and he was reading a draft environmental assessment report that his senior field officer had sent him, making notes in the margins in a handwriting that had not improved since the 1980s. His phone buzzed. He looked at it. A number he didn't recognize. He answered, "Mr. Drummond." The voice was a woman's, clear, unhurried. "My name is Helen Brandt. I'm a senior director at Natural Resources Canada. I'm calling because we're entering the formal tendering process for the Northern Environmental Stewardship Initiative, and your firm's name has come up in several conversations. I wanted to have a preliminary discussion before the RFP is officially posted." Walter set down his coffee. "I'm listening," he said. The Northern Environmental Stewardship Initiative was a federal program that had been in development for years, a long-term, multi-billion-dollar commitment to environmental monitoring and remediation across northern Canada. It was, in the language of people who tracked these things, the kind of contract that changed the scale of whatever firm held it. Walter had not applied for anything. He had not lobbied anyone. He had not been to a conference in 18 months. His phone had rung because people who awarded contracts of this nature had learned, over time, that when you wanted to know who actually understood the land and the communities and the work, you asked the communities themselves, and the communities had given a name. The Caldwell Group's announcement came 6 weeks after that phone call, an acquisition, a large one, of a Calgary-based environmental consulting firm, their stated move into the resource management sector. Marcus Caldwell gave a quote to the Financial Post about consolidation and competitive positioning and the importance of scale. The acquisition price had been approximately $380 million. Walter read the article on a Tuesday morning at his kitchen table in Kanata, the same house he'd lived in for 19 years, the one with the backyard that backed onto a ravine and the kitchen that still had the original linoleum because he'd always meant to replace it and then always found something more important to do. His daughter, Joanne, called him that afternoon. "Did you see the Caldwell announcement?" she asked. "I did," he said. $380, she said. "They paid $380 for Meridian." "I know. They offered us $470, she said. There was a pause. "Dad, They offered us more than they paid for a firm twice our size. I know, he said. There was a silence on the line that Joanne understood the way she understood most silences from her father, that it was full rather than empty. They didn't know about the co-management agreements, she said. It wasn't a question. They didn't ask, he said. And you didn't tell them. They weren't buying those agreements, he said. You can't buy them, that's the point. Joanne was quiet for a moment. She had her father's habit of going still when she was thinking something through. The NRC tender, she said. Preliminary conversations, he said. How preliminary? He looked out the kitchen window at the ravine. A pair of crows were doing something complicated in the top branches of a dead elm. Not very, he said. The formal offer from Natural Resources Canada came on a Thursday in February. Walter was in Yellowknife at the time, meeting with the leadership of one of the northern communities about the scope of work under the proposed initiative and what it would mean for their territory and their people. He had flown economy class. He had taken a cab from the airport. The offer was in structure and substance, unlike anything his firm had previously held. It was not an acquisition, it was a partnership. The federal government, the firm, and the communities, each with defined roles and genuine voice, none subordinate to the others. The value over the initial 7-year term was in the range of $900 million. Walter read the formal document that evening in a hotel room that smelled like the forced air heat of northern winters, dry and mineral and somehow clarifying. He read it carefully, the way he read every document, making notes in the margins. He called his general counsel. He called Joanne. 900, Joanne said. Approximately, he said. Dad, she said. I know, he said, if you'd taken the Caldwell offer. I know. She was quiet. Then, did you know this was coming? When you walked out of that boardroom? He thought about this honestly, the way he thought about everything. I knew what we'd built was worth more than what they were offering, he said. I didn't know exactly what form it would take. But you knew. I knew the agreements with the communities weren't on their balance sheet, he said, and I knew that eventually someone in government would ask the right questions. The work is there. It's real. That doesn't disappear because someone didn't think to look for it. Joanne breathed out slowly. They must have thought you were out of your mind. The younger one did, Walter said. He almost smiled. The father wasn't sure. Stuart Caldwell saw the federal announcement in March. He was at his desk in the tower on the 43rd floor, the same room where Walter Drummond had sat across from him 4 months earlier in a blazer that didn't fit. He read the announcement twice. He thought about the man who had come into this room and turned down $470 million without raising his voice, who had asked about the Saskatchewan and Nunavut contracts, who had told a story about a contaminated refinery and 14 hectares of soil and a 1998 pickup truck as though it were just a thing that had happened, not a case he was making. He thought about the question Walter had asked, what the numbers rested on, and realized that was not precisely what Walter had asked. Walter had simply told a story. Stuart had drawn his own conclusions about what was and was not on the table. He sat with that for a while. Then he called his assistant and asked her to pull the file on the Drummond meeting. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. He thought he might be looking for the moment he had stopped asking questions. Walter Drummond was not a man who kept trophies or told stories about his victories. He did not have a framed article on his wall or a shelf of industry awards. He had a photograph on his desk. His daughter at 8 years old, standing in a field somewhere in Manitoba, squinting into the sun, and he had the original federal certification that had allowed him to conduct independent environmental assessments, which was pinned to a corkboard behind his chair and had curled slightly at the corners from 23 years of existing. When people asked him, in the years that followed, about the Caldwell meeting and what it had felt like to walk away from that number, he never answered directly. He had a way of redirecting, toward the work, toward the communities, toward whatever specific problem was currently on his desk. But once, sitting in a coffee shop in Ottawa with a young engineer who had just joined the firm and was full of anxious questions about the industry and the future and what it took to build something that lasted, he came close. The thing about knowing what something is worth, Walter said, looking at his coffee, is that it doesn't actually require anyone else to agree with you. You just have to be clear about what you know and what you're willing to act on. He paused. The rest of it follows, eventually. The young engineer wrote this down. Walter noticed and didn't say anything about it. Outside the coffee shop, Wellington Street was doing what Wellington Street does in October, the leaves coming down from the maples in the median, orange and yellow in the gray light, the kind of afternoon that Ottawa does better than anywhere else, which is a thing that people who have lived there long enough know, and people who haven't don't believe until they see it. Walter finished his coffee. He put on his coat. He went back to work.